Silence after years of emotional noise carries a different kind of weight, the kind that does not announce itself with drama but arrives quietly, and changes everything in a moment that feels almost unreal. There is a point where constant understanding turns into distance, where patience no longer feels like strength but like exhaustion finally taking its shape. Most people assume that kindness is endless in certain individuals, especially those who feel deeply and care beyond limits. But psychology shows a different pattern beneath the surface. Emotional overload does not disappear. It accumulates, layer by layer, until the mind reaches a stage where even compassion starts to feel heavy. The most misunderstood shift in human behavior is not anger, not confrontation, not retaliation, but the moment emotional investment shuts down completely. This video is about that exact transformation. The moment when an empath reaches the edge of emotional endurance and something inside quietly breaks in a way that cannot be seen from the outside. What will be explored here is not just behavior, but the hidden process behind it, the gradual buildup that leads to emotional withdrawal, the psychological signals that appear long before the final shift, and the surprising changes that follow when a deeply caring personality stops engaging with the pain of others. There is a side of human nature rarely discussed, where excessive empathy becomes a burden instead of a gift, where absorbing the emotions of others starts to drain identity and inner stability. Over time, boundaries weaken, emotional fatigue increases, and a silent transformation begins without clear warning signs. This video will break down how that transformation happens step by step, what internal changes take place during emotional exhaustion, and why the final stage is often mistaken for coldness, when in reality it is self-preservation. It will also reveal the lesser-known psychological truth that emotional detachment is not sudden, but the result of prolonged overload, repeated disappointment, and the slow realization that not every emotional weight can be carried without consequence. As the story unfolds, the focus will move toward the moment of final shift, the point where response replaces reaction, where effort is replaced by silence, and where emotional availability no longer exists in the way people expect. This is where most misunderstandings occur, because from the outside it appears as change in personality, but internally it is a complete restructuring of emotional priorities. The video will also explain why this stage often creates discomfort in relationships, how people react when consistent emotional support disappears, and why the absence of constant reassurance can feel more powerful than any form of confrontation. By the end, there will be a clear understanding of what actually happens when emotional limits are reached, why certain individuals reach this point faster than others, and how emotional survival sometimes requires stepping away from everything that once felt natural. The goal is not only to observe this transformation, but to understand it in a deeper way that removes confusion and replaces it with clarity. Every part of this breakdown is designed to show the unseen side of emotional endurance and the cost of carrying feelings that were never meant to be carried alone. Stay with this video until the end, because the final part reveals the most important truth about emotional breaking points, and why they often lead to a complete shift in identity that most people never expect or understand. If this message resonates and you want more deep psychological insights like this, welcome to the channel, and consider subscribing so you do not miss the next story that uncovers the hidden layers of human behavior. The hidden life of an empath does not begin with anything dramatic or visible to others. It begins in the quiet way they observe everything around them without needing to be told. Small changes in tone, slight shifts in behavior, unspoken discomfort in a room, and emotional tension that most people ignore are instantly picked up and processed internally. This constant awareness creates a mental state where nothing is truly neutral, because every interaction carries emotional weight. Along with this sensitivity comes a deep sense of responsibility, not because someone asks for it, but because it feels automatic. When someone is upset, struggling, or distant, the empath does not simply notice it. They feel pulled toward it, as if the emotional imbalance around them needs to be corrected. Over time, this creates a pattern where they slowly become the emotional support system for almost everyone in their life. Friends, family, partners, even casual connections start to rely on their ability to understand, absorb, and stabilize emotional situations that others cannot handle. What looks like strength from the outside is actually a continuous process of emotional absorption, where feelings that do not belong to them are taken in and carried as if they do. This creates a silent pressure that builds internally, because there is no natural release point for what they absorb from others. In this constant exchange of emotions, forgiveness becomes almost automatic. Mistakes that would normally end relationships for others are often overlooked, not because they are ignored, but because the empath sees the emotional reason behind them. They try to understand instead of reacting, to explain instead of judging, and to heal instead of walking away. This creates a pattern where second chances are given repeatedly, even when logic suggests otherwise. Staying becomes easier than leaving, because leaving would mean breaking the emotional connection that they have already invested in deeply. This is why they often remain in situations longer than most people would tolerate. It is not due to lack of awareness, but due to an internal conflict between what they feel and what they know. Emotional understanding keeps pulling them back, even when experience tells them to step away. Over time, this creates a cycle where their patience is mistaken for availability, and their understanding is mistaken for permission to continue the same behavior. The more they forgive, the more others unconsciously begin to expect forgiveness, and this expectation slowly becomes part of the relationship dynamic. The psychological layer beneath this behavior reveals something more complex. The same qualities that make an empath deeply compassionate also make them highly vulnerable to emotional exploitation. Because they are naturally inclined to understand pain rather than reject it, they often end up in environments where their emotional capacity is used without equal return. They give attention, comfort, and emotional stability, but receive imbalance in return without always realizing it immediately. This does not happen all at once, it builds slowly over time, and that is what makes it dangerous. There is no single moment that signals something is wrong. Instead, there are small patterns that repeat until they become normal. Emotional responsibility becomes one-sided, where the empath carries the emotional weight of multiple people while still trying to maintain their own inner balance. The slow buildup that nobody sees begins in these repeated moments that seem small individually but become heavy collectively. Disrespect does not always appear as open conflict. It can appear as being dismissed, ignored, or emotionally overlooked in subtle ways. Emotional manipulation does not always look intentional. It can appear as guilt, dependency, or shifting responsibility onto the empath without direct acknowledgement. One-sided relationships form when effort is not balanced but still accepted because the empath continues to give without measuring return. Being ignored becomes normalized when attention is only given when others need emotional support. Being taken for granted slowly replaces appreciation because consistent availability creates expectation rather than gratitude. All of these experiences accumulate quietly, not in memory alone, but in emotional energy that is continuously spent without recovery. What makes this process more intense is that the empath does not immediately recognize the toll it is taking. Their focus remains on understanding others, solving emotional problems, and maintaining harmony, even when their own emotional state begins to weaken. This creates a situation where they are carrying multiple emotional burdens at once while their own needs remain unattended. Over time, this leads to a state known as empathy fatigue, where the ability to continuously absorb and process other people's emotions begins to decline. Emotional exhaustion does not appear as one clear moment. It appears as reduced energy, slower emotional response, and a growing internal sense of distance that is difficult to explain. The mind starts to protect itself without conscious decision, and emotional engagement begins to feel heavier than before. The breaking point is often misunderstood because it does not arrive with visible intensity. There is no dramatic explosion, no sudden confrontation, and no public breakdown that signals change. Instead, it is usually something extremely small that triggers it, something that appears insignificant to others, but carries the final emotional weight for the empath. It can be a repeated pattern being ignored once again, a promise that is not kept for the last time, or a situation that repeats exactly as it has before without any sign of change. In that moment, something internal shifts. It is not anger that rises, but clarity. A final realization begins to form, not as emotion, but as understanding that nothing in the situation is going to change regardless of effort, patience, or care. This realization becomes the turning point where internal processing changes direction. Instead of trying to fix, explain, or absorb, the mind begins to withdraw from emotional involvement. The empath suddenly sees the full pattern without emotional distortion, and what once felt manageable now appears repetitive and unchangeable. This is where the internal shift begins, not as reaction but as awareness. The connection between effort and outcome breaks, and emotional investment no longer feels justified in the same way. What follows is not immediate action, but internal separation, where emotional energy is no longer freely given into the same cycle. The most terrifying transformation does not happen in a single visible moment. It unfolds gradually in behavior that others initially misunderstand. At first, the change is subtle, almost unnoticeable, because the empath continues to exist in the same environment, continues to respond, and continues to interact, but something essential inside the pattern has shifted. The need to explain every feeling, every boundary, every discomfort begins to disappear. Where there was once effort to make others understand, there is now silence. This silence is not confusion or emotional weakness. It is the result of repeated experiences where explanation did not lead to change. Over time, words start to feel unnecessary because they no longer serve a purpose. Alongside this, the urge to chase people emotionally begins to fade. Situations that once triggered deep involvement now create distance instead of reaction. The emotional energy that was previously spent trying to hold connections together is redirected inward, not as revenge or anger, but as self-protection that develops naturally. As this transformation continues, the pattern of fixing everything also begins to break. The empath no longer feels responsible for repairing every emotional imbalance around them. Problems that once felt urgent now feel distant, as if they belong to someone else's responsibility. This is a significant shift because for a long time, their identity was built around being the one who restores emotional stability for others. When that role stops, people around them start to notice confusion. The dynamic they were used to begins to collapse quietly. The constant availability they depended on is no longer guaranteed. Emotional rescue is no longer automatic. Endless chances that were once given without hesitation are no longer extended in the same way. This change creates discomfort for those who were accustomed to receiving consistent understanding without limits. What they begin to face is not rejection in a loud sense, but the presence of boundaries that they were never required to respect before. This is where confusion becomes more intense. People who were used to emotional flexibility suddenly encounter emotional structure. The empath no longer adjusts endlessly to maintain comfort for others. Instead, there is a quiet firmness that replaces previous patterns of overgiving. This creates a psychological shift in relationships because expectations no longer match reality. Where forgiveness used to be automatic, now it requires acknowledgement of behavior. Where emotional rescue used to happen without question, now there is space left for consequences to exist. The absence of constant explanation makes the change even more difficult for others to interpret, because silence replaces what used to be emotional engagement. Without that engagement, people are forced to face boundaries for the first time in a relationship dynamic they believed had no limits. The reason this version creates fear in others is not because of hostility, but because of unfamiliarity. Most people are never mentally prepared for the moment an empath withdraws from their emotional role. There is a long-standing assumption that understanding, forgiveness, and return are permanent traits, not temporary behaviors. The expectation is that no matter what happens, the empath will eventually come back to restore balance, repair emotional distance, or continue providing support. This assumption becomes deeply embedded in relationships over time. However, when the emotional supply suddenly disappears, that entire structure collapses. What remains is a dynamic that no longer functions in the same way, because one side has stopped participating in the cycle that maintained it. As this shift continues, the emotional environment changes completely. The empath is no longer part of the repetitive cycle of overgiving and emotional absorption. The patterns that once defined the relationship are no longer active. This creates a form of silence that is difficult for others to interpret. It is not silence born from anger, nor silence used as punishment. It is silence that comes from emotional withdrawal after prolonged imbalance. This absence of reaction becomes more powerful than any confrontation, because it removes the emotional response that others may have depended on to maintain control or predictability. Without that response, uncertainty increases, and with it, discomfort grows. At a deeper level, the most terrifying case is not when emotion turns into anger, but when it turns into complete emotional detachment. This is the stage where the empath no longer reacts in the way they once did. There is no desire to argue, no need to express frustration, and no intention to seek revenge or create emotional conflict. Instead, there is a calm separation that removes emotional investment entirely. This is not suppression of feelings, but absence of attachment to outcomes that once mattered deeply. When this stage is reached, emotional connection does not disappear suddenly. It becomes irrelevant. Situations that once triggered strong emotional responses now fail to produce any internal disturbance. This shift creates a condition where communication continues externally, but internal emotional involvement is no longer present. Once this level of emotional closure is reached, many relationships cannot return to their previous state. The reason is not punishment but transformation. The emotional foundation that sustained the connection no longer exists in the same form. Attempts to restore previous dynamics often fail because the internal structure that supported those dynamics has already changed. What remains is a version of interaction that is based on necessity rather than emotional engagement. This is often misunderstood by those who were accustomed to the earlier version of the empath, where care and emotional availability were constant. The most unexpected truth behind this transformation is that it is not driven by anger. It is not a sudden emotional collapse or an act of retaliation. It is an awakening that occurs after repeated emotional overload and prolonged imbalance. At some point, the empath begins to prioritize internal stability over external emotional demands. This is the moment where self-preservation becomes more important than maintaining unhealthy emotional cycles. For the first time, attention is directed inward, not as isolation, but as protection. Energy that was previously distributed outward without limits is now conserved and redirected toward personal well-being. This shift is often misinterpreted by others as coldness or emotional withdrawal, but in reality, it is a restructuring of emotional priorities. The empath stops sacrificing their well-being for emotional stability that was never equally maintained. The change is not about rejecting people, but about refusing to continue patterns that caused internal depletion. Those who benefited from the previous version of unlimited emotional availability often perceive this change as cruelty, because it disrupts the dynamic they were comfortable with. However, from the internal perspective of the empath, it is not cruelty at all. It is the beginning of survival, where emotional balance is no longer sacrificed for the sake of maintaining connections that were built on imbalance. The breaking point of an empath rarely arrives with noise or chaos. It does not announce itself in a way that others can easily recognize or prepare for. Instead, it builds slowly over time, shaped by quiet endurance, repeated emotional weight, and countless moments where understanding was given without receiving the same in return. What looks like patience from the outside is often silent exhaustion on the inside, and what appears as strength is sometimes just the ability to keep going despite carrying more than one person should ever have to carry. Over the years, this emotional load does not disappear. It accumulates in layers until it reaches a point where something inside finally decides it is no longer sustainable. At that stage, the change is not loud or dramatic, but final. A single internal decision forms after a long process of emotional fatigue, where continuing to give, explain, or absorb no longer feels possible. This is not a reaction built on anger, but a realization shaped by clarity. The most difficult part for others to understand is not what happens after this shift, but what led to it. Because once the weight is finally put down, the silence that follows is often misunderstood. Yet that silence carries the full truth of everything that was endured before the decision was made. And in many cases, the most unsettling realization is not the change itself, but the understanding of how much was carried for so long without recognition. The emotional labor, the forgiveness, the patience, and the constant effort to maintain balance in situations that were never balanced in return. When all of that stops, the absence feels different, because it reveals the true scale of what was once being held quietly. If this message connected with you in any way, take a moment to reflect on it. There is often more strength in emotional awareness than in emotional reaction, and understanding that difference can change how we see ourselves and others. If you found value in this video, make sure to like, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe to the channel for more deep psychological content like this. Your support helps us bring more powerful insights about human behavior, emotions, and the hidden side of the mind.